All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so happy to have you all here. That I think that's the biggest attendance we had on these tech talks. So, yeah, I see 16 people. So, hey, and so that's yeah, exactly. So that's the third one. I might have lost count already, but I think I'm pretty sure it's the third one. And we have Michele Williams this time. That is, yeah, she's waving over there. So say hello.
It's my gallery view, you can see me.
And so she is here to give a talk about user experience. So user experience is, I like that topic because user experience is one of the things like maybe you know when you see it kind of thing, but it's there's actually more to it. There's an actual like science behind it. And so Michele has been very involved in that field, especially at a company at Pearson, which is like this higher education company. But she also has, which is pretty cool, a PhD in human-centered computing. So that is, yeah, like we can see it on the wall over there. So she's the boss. And yeah, so I guess I'll just keep it very short, but yeah, we're really honored to have you, Michele, and we're very excited to hear what you have to teach us about UX.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I was hoping you wouldn't define it because I was like, oh, that's going to be my whole talk. So don't say what it is because
yeah, I was like trying to be like, okay, I'm going to keep it just to something.
Oh, no, that's good. So hi, everyone again. Michelle's 1L actually, so that helps you spell it and remember it and all of that. So I'm going to try and share my screen, and then also I'm going to click the share computer sound because I do have a video. So, okay, I'm going to please restart your audio sharing application.
Oh no.
Oh no. Okay, so you guys should be seeing slides.
Yep.
So again, the whole crux of this is what is user experience. So for those of you who may actually be user experience professionals, this is going to be not for you. Because my understanding is that you guys' group is very much catered to people new to the tech industry and learning about all the different aspects of being in the tech industry, and user experience is one of those. So I am here to introduce to you a topic that you may not have even heard of, yet you may find you have experienced, have done, and have had some interest in. And I'm possibly even here to recruit you out of being a developer and into UX. So again, I'm Dr. Michele Williams. Currently, I am doing independent consulting. So I'm an owner of a company I named MAW Consulting LLC, making accessibility work. And I sit in kind of three backgrounds. So software engineering and computer science, user experience, primarily the research side of that, and then also accessibility. And those right now, at least, are kind of three different things. And with this slide, I'll pause here just to actually give you my background. And we were chatting earlier about like storytelling. So this is where I'll kind of sit back and tell a little bit of a story of how I even got to all of this and all these degrees and all that kind of stuff. So I started way back when, excuse me, getting a bachelor's in computer science. I didn't quite even know what computer science was, but I knew I liked math and computers, so let's just do this thing. I told my mom, I don't want to be a programmer, and she's like, you know, that's what computer science is, right? And I was like, whatever. And then I programmed for 4 years. So I have that background. Decided to go to grad school rather than go straight into working, and liked software engineering. So my master's is a master's of software engineering. My undergrad, by the way, just for in case people want to know a little more about my background, is from an HBCU called Bowie State. And then my master's in software engineering is from Auburn, War Eagle. But when I was getting my master's, I started to take some classes in this stuff called human-computer interaction. And that's when I began to realize that I was actually doing user experience in undergrad before I knew it was a thing. And by the end of this, you might find that you've had a similar kind of aha moment as well. So during software engineering degree, I was kind of minoring, I guess, in taking as many user experience classes as I could and HCI classes. Then I went to work. I worked as a voice user interface designer. So I do have a background in UI design, but in voice, meaning I was working on those telephone systems where you talk to a computer instead of a human. Everybody hates those, except blind people. Blind people like them, haha. But otherwise, everyone hates those. I'm sorry, it wasn't my fault. Because you also learn when you're doing design that there are a lot of stakeholders who have a lot of say in what you do. You don't have full autonomy. Anyhow, so I did that for 5 years because I had a unique background in that. I had a friend who was in it, but really I had also been introduced to this concept of accessibility in my master's as well, but I didn't know how to get into that field. About 5 years into being a GUI designer, the economy was changing, company was having layoffs. I decided I wanted to really pursue accessibility and thankfully found a job as an accessibility analyst for a company that's now called Level Access. It was called SSB Park Group at the time. So that job trained me up in how to test websites, hardware, software against standards like Section 508 and WCAG. So I have that that's more so my passion and where my expertise really hones in as well. Once I started as an accessibility specialist, I really loved accessibility. And for me, coming out of the academic world, I already have a bachelor's, already have a master's. Okay, let's do a PhD. I did not know what a PhD entailed. I'm glad I didn't, because if I did, I wouldn't have gotten it or I wouldn't have tried. But nonetheless, I did pursue a PhD in human-centered computing, so in this field. And that was focused on the more research aspects of getting users involved, and then also accessibility. I worked exclusively with people with disabilities throughout my tenure there and my internships as well. So that brought me a short stint at Intel, and then brought me to Pearson in the higher ed department. So I was a senior UX researcher focused on accessibility at Pearson. So putting all those things together. And then now again, I'm doing independent consulting around mostly accessibility as well. But my background, education, and work sits in between really the two of UX and accessibility. So ask me anything about those as we go along. Feel free to interrupt as well. I can kind of see some of you all in the view, but also my mouse cursor is not showing me everything, so I can't click around on the screen, unfortunately. But do whatever interruption you need to ask me about any of that. But I wanted to just give you some background on me to give you some context for the rest of the talk and any questions you might have. So user experience has a particular origin and definition, and the primary author of even that term is Don Norman, Dr. Don Norman out of, I shouldn't have said that. I think it's Stanford. But you might know his name from the Nielsen Norman Group, very famous, basically seminal group around this idea of user experience. So rather than me trying to define user experience, we're going to just hear Dr. Norman give that definition. And this is where I hope the speakers work. But if not, we can read the captions.
Hi, I'm Angie Lee, and I'm here at the UX conference in San Francisco. I got to ask Don Norman what he thinks about the term UX.
Once upon a time, a very long time ago, I was at Apple. And we said the experience of using these computers is weak. The experience, when you first discover it, when you see it in the store, when you buy it, when you can't fit it into the car. It's in this great big box. It doesn't fit into the car. And when you finally do get it home, opening the box up and, oh, it looks scary. I don't know if I dare put this computer together. All of that is user experience. It's everything that touches upon your experience with the product. And it may not even be near the product. It may be when you're telling somebody else about it. That's what we meant when we devised the term user experience and set up what we call the User Experience Architect's Office at Apple to try to enhance things. Now, Apple was already pretty good, so we were starting with a good product, making it even better. Today, that term has been horribly misused. It's used by people to say, I'm a user experience designer. I design websites or I design apps. And they have no clues to what they're doing. And they think the experience is that simple device, the website or the app or who knows what. No, it's everything. It's the way you experience the world. It's the way you experience your life. It's the way you experience the service. Or, yeah, an app or a computer system. but it's a system that's everything. Got it?
Thank you, Don Norman. Okay, so going back to our slides. So as I mentioned, and as is listed out on their website, it is the all-encompassing aspects of an end user's interaction with the company, its service, and its product. That is user experience. So it's not to be confused with, say, UI. We always hear those two things together. UI refers to the user interface, the thing the user is engaging with, and the presentation of that. But that's not the totality of user experience, and it's also not usability, which again is another subset of this topic and has to do with how you engage with something and how easy or difficult that is. But again, that's not the totality of this term, user experience. So that kind of gets out the way, like even the definition of what is this user experience. To delve into it a little bit more, we actually have to take a little bit of a step back and acknowledge the field of human-computer interaction, however, so HCI. HCI comes from the concept and the idea and the acknowledgement that computers, as they were starting to be formed, and particularly as we know them now as personal computing devices, not just these things that run numbers, there is a complexity to them that is more than just, say, a hammer, which once you build it, it deals with nails, pulls them out, puts them in. That's what we do. The computer is so complex that there is a dialogue, there is an interaction, there is an engagement with the human that needs to be accounted for in a way that has a higher level of understanding and structure than, again, just something that is a rote tool. So we get this term primarily from a paper and then ultimately a book in 1983 called The Psychology of Human-Computer Interaction by Stuart Carr. I think it's Thomas Moran, and then Alan Newell. So again, this sort of field of study, field of thought, that really pulls from a lot of other different fields like behavioral sciences, computer science, media studies, it pulls from a lot of different psychology, all of that, to understand that there is an engagement that we need to be aware of, design for, account for. So taking that, then we come into this idea of user experience, usability, and what these particular engagements, particularly around computers, look like. So we talked about Don Norman. The other half of the NN group is Jakob Nielsen. And around the same time, 1993, that Don Norman was coining the phrase user experience in his group, Jakob Nielsen was creating a book called Usability, or published a book called Usability Engineering. So now we start to see this idea of a community of practice, a structure around building for the usefulness and usability of the artifacts that we're creating digitally. Then a few years later, more known widely, even more so, is the 10 usability heuristics that Jakob Nielsen and another colleague initially created, and then Nielsen revised. I want to actually take some time to talk about the usability heuristics because they're so important to the field. And I think they'll also start to give an understanding of what we mean by user experience, user interface, and good practices. So these heuristics, again, are just rules of thumb, as they say, broad rules of thumb, not specific to do or not to do, but they are guidelines that were published again around 1994, and they still really hold today, but they are trying to get at the writing down and the culminating of what makes something good versus bad. What are these best practices that the community should be looking out for as we are developing this interface of the World Wide Web, for instance. So the heuristics read as follows: the visibility of system status. So the system should always keep users informed of what's going on through appropriate feedback within reasonable time. Then we have match between system and real world. So this has to do with the language and the phrasing and just trying to stay away from jargon, but also reading order, logical order of the way you're using your system. User control and freedom. So they always talk about a clearly marked emergency exit, but giving users choice around what they do, supporting redo and undo, not making it so rigid that the users, are even fearful of making a mistake or experimenting around with what you've created for them. Consistency and standards. So we want to try to have conventions. We want to try to make it so that when users are going from website to website, that they understand what's going on without having to relearn the system every time. Error prevention, which is better than error messages, which we do get to later, but making sure that basically it's easy to understand what you should be doing and eliminate error-prone conditions or eliminate opportunity for users to stumble. A big one that I often talk about is recognition rather than recall. This is the concept of making it clear making it clear to users what they should do by having it clearly, on the interface, however appropriate that makes sense, rather than me having to remember all the steps. I'm sure you guys have experienced websites where you have to remember in your brain what all the steps are, as opposed to it being very clear what that looks like. Flexibility and efficiency of use. So this has to do with moving from a novice user to an expert user and providing an experience that caters to all of that spectrum. So this may mean, they call it accelerators, things like keyboard shortcuts, things like that. Providing that will again allow a flexibility in how I use it and gives the user more control than just being very rigid. Aesthetic and minimalist design. So again, thinking back to 1994 and what websites might have looked like back then, we don't want an abundance of information. We don't want an abundance of artwork or anything else that we really don't need to help declutter and get the user to accomplishing their tasks. Number 9 is help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So if there is an error, help users get over it. Don't make it such that they just completely exit out, can't recover, can't complete their task. And then lastly, help and documentation, which we never want to do, but that is important to document what is happening, particularly for complex systems, and provide good systems of help. I want to also point out towards the end, there's almost like a footnote here of how these came about, but this is a theme that I have throughout this presentation as well, which is understanding where these things came from. So Jakob said, I originally developed the heuristics for heuristic evaluation in collaboration with their colleague Molik in 1990. Then refined the heuristics based on a factor analysis of 249 usability problems in 1994 to derive a set of heuristics with maximum explanatory power, resulting in this revised set of heuristics, and again later in 1994, and there are papers around this that you can see here. So the reason I say that I wanted to point that out as well is because I want to really drive home that these things are developed over a significant amount of time, effort, research, testing, iteration. These things do not just kind of magically come together. And that goes back to user experience being an entire body of work. It is a culmination of a lot of methods, and it's a field of practice that you do. And that's how you're able to create and innovate in these ways. And all these things had to be created. They didn't just magically appear. Another seminal work that is often referenced in regards to user experience is Don Norman's book, which came out 2002, which is Design of Everyday Things. So this really started to really become, again, another push for people to design mindfully. And so we get the key takeaway of affordances from this book, and even in the updated version of the book cover, there's a red teapot and it has the handle and the spout on the same side, because that's sort of what the book goes into. The book goes into this idea that you should be designing with a mindfulness, you should be designing with a purpose, you should be designing for what the person is going to be doing, and you should be giving them a clue of how to do that. The example I always kept from this book was doors. And sometimes you find doors that have the handle on both sides, and therefore you don't know whether to push or pull. And Don Norman points out, like, if you just make one side flat and the other side have the handle, then that is an affordance to know one side pulls and the other side pushes. So these are the things that, as user experience people, this is what he's talking about when he says that it's about, you know, thinking about the totality of this person using this thing. How is that going to go? And then how can I help guide you? How can I help you through that? How can I design in a way that is, again, the word that always comes to mind for me is mindful of that. And then how can we make that the best experience possible? So combining, again, the work of Jakob Nielsen with some of these design best practices, with the idea that there is a user that you can study and engage with the idea that there is a human-computer interaction. Hopefully now you're starting to see that it's mostly about creating a good experience, but that doesn't happen, again, by accident. That happens by systematic approaches to doing that. So this is where I get into my opinion piece. So this is just me talking, okay, and these next two slides, but I'm not talking completely out of turn here. So what early UX included for me, at learning about it in the academic setting and studying it as long as I have, are things like innovations and inventions backed by science. So you had a lot of research that backed all of these things that we know and come to understand. And this research was not trivial. These things pulled from decades worth of experimentation. So for instance, there's something called Fitts Law. Peter Fitts had a paper in 1954 that became very helpful once the invention of the mouse came, because I'm going to read Fitts Law, I don't have it off the top of my head, I'm not that good. A predictive model of human movement. So Fitts Law states that the amount of time required for a person to move a pointer, like a mouse cursor, to a target area is a function of the distance to the target area divided by the target. Thus, the longer the distance and the smaller the target size, the longer it takes. Yeah, so really long way of saying that, you know, distance and size matter. But we don't know that until we know that, right? So once the mouse came about, we didn't know about target sizes and where to put stuff on the page. And so there were really smart people who pulled from research like this 1954 paper about target size and distance to then pull that into, say, user experience and learn how to optimize how you set up and lay out your page and how you lay out these elements on the page. There wasn't such thing as a checkbox until there was such thing as a checkbox. So all of these things came about with a lot of really scientific research and deep dives and systemic and systematic approaches. The other thing we have is the creation of the design and evaluation. How do we know something is good? How do we know something is usable? How do we know something is addressing a person's needs? So that goes back to Jakob Nielsen's work of categorizing usability problems and then further categorizing that into heuristics. We have methods that are starting to come about in terms of how we do research, like task analysis. You break down someone's task into the ittiest-bittiest portions. So I put my hand on the mouse, I move the mouse to a target, I click it, how long I click it, I move it back. You know, you do all of this because you're really trying to home in on what is the exact experience and where can we optimize along the way to keep iterating and making it as streamlined, as easy, as less tedious, less cognitive load as possible. Or you have measurements like time on task. You start to create measurements like that so we can measure how long does it take for you to accomplish that task. And then as we make an improvement, we measure that again. We see if we have an improvement. And we also use other methods to engage with users and start to iterate on this. So these are the things that we had back in 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, as this, again, idea of a personal computing device is coming about. And as we get this idea that it shouldn't stink to use it, you shouldn't be afraid to use it. It shouldn't be a pain to use it. It should be fun. It should be engaging. How do we go about doing that? Now, here's where, again, my opinion comes in, but I don't think I'm wrong. Unfortunately, current UX seems to be drawing pretty pictures and asking people, what do you think? Now, that wasn't just me, because if you remember, Don Norman said people are throwing around this UX term a lot. And I'm being a bit dramatic, but not really, because I think in trying to abstract what is an entire body of field of work, I think that we've abstracted too much. And unfortunately, I think we've even abstracted in the field. So I think people who get into UX sometimes have this view as well, that we're just about making something visually pleasing and aesthetic. And then when it comes to research, we'll just put it in front of people and get their opinion. And I understand a little bit about where this probably came from. The first is trying to get, say, a business to create a UX team. How do you get someone who's business minded, who's about faster, leaner, get it out the door? How do you get them to invest in a team that's likely going to slow things down and take a little bit more time to understand what they're doing and get it right? So you probably tell them, well, it's going to look better, or you tell them something that you think that they can understand and want to hear. Because you're not necessarily going to tell them, well, we're going to be able to make it an easier time, or things that they can ROI, return on investment in their mind. You probably don't explain it that way. So I could see that being one reason. Another reason is the field did start to feel a little too scientific, and it might have scared some people off. So what you don't want is for the field to not feel attainable. You want diversity, just like you have diversity in your users, you want diversity in your user experience professionals. So schools and boot camps and all of that want to recruit people to their programs. And so they may have also used some advertising to make it feel a little bit more appealing and attainable as well. So that might have had a factor too. But I think also, a big factor was Apple, and what Apple was doing back in particularly the early mid 2000s, when they were coming out back to back to back with these crazy innovations. We went from the Mac and how that changed, and then we've got this iPod with your music, and then we've got this iPhone, and then we've got this iPad. And it seemed like, particularly as consumers, if you're not in the tech world and you're just sitting back watching, this is where you start to get people feeling like technology moves at this fast pace, and oh my gosh, I can hardly keep up, and innovation. But they didn't realize those devices were decades in the making. And there's a story that, Steve Jobs stole everything from Xerox PARC. It's not true. But the idea is that, there were research labs spending years on every aspect of what those devices, from the hardware side and the software side and the engagement side, were doing. Each aspect of that had been studied, improved, and worked on and massaged for a long, long time before everything finally clicked. And people had even tried to sell tablets years before, but the market wasn't ready. So that was part of the innovation, as well as knowing when to introduce it and when the market was ready. But I think, again, the perception came that if Apple is coming out every year with something spectacular, okay, we've got to come out every year with something spectacular. So I think the robustness, to me as a UX professional, I find that some of the robustness goes away because people feel like things should move quickly, and they don't recognize that good stuff, long-lasting designs and long-lasting principles and long-lasting artifacts don't come quickly. They come from iteration and mistakes and recovering from those mistakes and all of that. And so, again, I think, unfortunately, we then get teams who are focused on keeping up with what they perceive to be fast-paced technology, hearing something like user experience. Oh yeah, we need those user experience people, come on over. But then they try to rush what really is sometimes a longer process. Now, Again, I come from an academic world, and you may find some industry people who say, oh, it doesn't take that long, oh, it's not that deep. I tend to push back a little bit on that because I think, again, that scientific rigor does take time no matter what. You can try to find ways to make that more appealing to business. And Jakob Nielsen actually has a book around that as well. How do you get this into business? But I think overall, there still is something to creating and iterating and proving out that just is physics almost. You know, there's just no getting around the fact that that takes a little bit of time to do. Okay, so soapbox over. And let me know again if you have any questions. All right, so why does this matter to a group of people who study code? Well, what hopefully will happen is the UX team of whatever company you get hired to will be a direct partner to you on the dev team. So hopefully first of all, the company has a UX team. And then if so, they should be partnered with you guys. So basically you don't have to be your own designer or researcher, writer, all the things. So I found this nice graphic from uxplanet.org. I don't agree with it entirely, but what they have here is overlapping circles between UX design, being like the research, the wireframing, the asset management and creation. Then that overlaps with something they're calling a UX engineer. So the overlap is ideation, design, testing, and reviews, and redesign. They have a UX engineer who does prototyping, UI component development, UI maintenance, and styling architecture. And then that begins to overlap with the front-end engineer who does, where they do implementation, technical feasibility, and backlog management. And then the front-end engineer has performance and some other things, SEO and queries. So this sort of is it. I would almost put it more in kind of a loop, but I still like the diagram and I like what it was trying to say, because this is essentially what should kind of be happening. Your technical knowledge should be feeding into the ultimate design and what the users are going to ultimately engage with. And then a person's knowledge of user engagement and design principles should be influencing, therefore, what you code up. So there should be a relationship that feeds off of one another such that everyone is using their strengths and then using that information back and forth to create the best thing ultimately for the user. Additionally, I would also add back-end engineer into this as well, because I think one of the things we often forget is that I can only present what the back-end has, or I can only use what the back-end has to offer. So for instance, when I was a voice user interface designer, I could only, I could only streamline so much as we had the information in the database. So a lot of times people get upset with, for instance, the number of questions a voice telephone system asks them. Part of the reason I have to ask you so many questions is because we don't store certain information about you. But if we're smart enough to, say, read the phone number you're calling in from, and we have that in a database that we can query to get account information, and for instance, see you called us yesterday about certain issue, then I can more intelligently call or answer the phone and say, I saw you called yesterday. Are you calling about this issue you were calling about yesterday? And then we can streamline the call from there. That kind of interaction depends on the front and back end as much as it depends on what the designer wrote up. So that's what I mean about there should be a relationship with all of these different facets. And of course, we never really mentioned testing, but testing needs to be involved as well to understand that whole interaction from beginning to end and make sure that that whole thing makes sense as well and validate the whole thing. So, so that's why user experience is brought up in a venue like this, because even if you stay within your field of coding, you need to understand that there's a group of people that you're going to likely be interacting with and engaging with that are going to be influencing what you do. So I found this other graphic on a site called Design Excellent, excuse me, and it talks about a few of the roles even within UX. Now I was kind of not negative, but I talked about some of the bad with user experience kind of blowing up into this field, and sometimes therefore the definition can kind of blow up as well and not be pure But one of the benefits of user experience being brought more to the forefront is that now we've got specialties within UX that we didn't always have before, but are really, really useful. So this little pyramid that they've put together is one example of what would be a really good design and UX team. So they've got a UX lead at the top, but then I'll kind of start within the different areas from the second row down. So researcher. So again, I'm primarily a UX researcher. So a UX researcher is responsible for collecting insights from the user group. So you get representative users and you use methods to engage with them before, during, and after some product release, feature release, whatever. And you bring that information back to help guide and recommend to the rest of the team the direction that you should go. Oftentimes, research is mostly associated with usability testing. That's just one of 100 methods that we can use. Usability testing is very specific to once you've built something, did you get it right? But there's a lot that happens before, during, and after to engage with users and get an understanding of their life, their lifestyle, as well as the actual artifact that you're making. Interaction designer, this is really important and often left out, but this is someone who engages with more like the behavior, the sequencing, the flow. I love the picture that they used here of almost like an org chart or a flow chart. That's really important because not everyone can abstract to that level and understand like the whole picture. Where is the person going? What journey are they taking? Do they even need to go from one page to another page, or can everything be accomplished in one fell swoop? What are the tasks that they're doing, and what is that path? And is the user going to understand that path? I've also seen interaction design get into more specific literal interaction, particularly as mobile becomes more pervasive, the gestures. What are the gestures that users are doing to engage with your application? And interaction designers can also somewhat get involved in that as well, depending on how you interpret that interaction. Content strategist is not one I'm completely familiar with. It's still relatively new. That one is more like the editorial side, like the SEO or the information architecture. I know it more as information architecture, which again sort of gets a little bit into the interaction design, but also again, it's just a higher level picture of what is the whole thing? Does it make sense for users to take all these steps? How do they get back? That's usually the fun one, you know, okay, I went down this path. Now that I'm finished, what happens now? And can I do a full loop? Do I get stuck? Because some people can only think the forward path, they can't think back. So there's a lot of, you know, names for those kind of things. And some of those are kind of tie into those too. And then lastly, in terms of UX roles as a visual designer, that's the one that people mostly think about. When they think of like a UX designer, they think of a visual designer, but that's actually just one piece of it. I often relate it to like, we're not making, like if we're talking about web, we're not making magazines. So it's not necessarily just about catching someone's attention and it looking a certain way. People have to engage with it. They have to interact with it. They have to know their path and what they're trying to do. So it's not just about the visual presentation, but it's about, again, the overall strategy, the page structure, the flow of it. And if you're on mobile, maybe even the gestures of it. So that all of that needs to work together to create the user experience. And then again, getting that feedback from the users and understanding the users and what they need and how they understand what you're creating is all important. And then they have front-end dev here as well, which again would be ideal. And one way to interpret that is a newish concept as well, is putting front-end dev in the UX team as something like a creative technologist or a prototyper, such that they code out what the designers and creators are creating. And that even feeds back into research, because now you can do research with a working prototype and get even more rich feedback before you really hand it off and tie it in front end and back end and make it live. And then the UX lead, of course, would coordinate all of that and also start to work on design language, design systems, things like that. Also not mentioned in here, but probably would maybe sit around the content strategist, is more like a writer. So again, that might be involved in a content strategist, but some teams have also started to hire writers, and there's a UX writer field now, so important. The words are so important, the tone, the language, even capitalization, you know, all of that is really, really important to the look and feel of that user interface, what the user is going to engage with, particularly if we're talking about web and applications. So those are some UX roles if you weren't familiar with that. Couple last things, working with UX, this is actually a preview of something that I think EJ and I are gonna some kind of way write an article or do a talk one day or something about how this relationship can work better. But there's just some realities around if you are a developer working with a UX team. So to make that better, first bullet point I have here is understand everyone's points of view. So for example, with a researcher, research doesn't always answer the question that we sought to answer. That's why it's called research and you got to redo it. So there may be some pressures there to answer a certain question and we can't do it. Or the designers have a lot of pressure for how things look. People judge books by their cover. So the designers may be under pressure from a lot of stakeholders giving them feedback and not approving what they've done until something looks a certain way or whatever, you know. So just understand the points of view of what's happening, both the ideal and the pressure cooker situations, and acknowledging and understanding that might help your relationship a little better. The second thing is everyone reviews design. Everyone reviews, particularly the UX design. So everyone thinks they have an opinion, they know what they're talking about, they can relate to it, their job depends on, you know, getting this feature out. So, you know, they're really honing in on every little pixel of everything. So just understand that that's a pressure that is probably going to be different than you as a developer. You're going to get your code reviewed, but in a different way, right? So someone might use what you're doing and make sure it works or make sure, you know, there's no lag, whatever, but no one's going to sit down and read your code because they don't understand code. But people think they understand design because they can see it. So there's a lot of pressure there. But also I put on here, expect your artifacts late. Because so many stakeholders are going to have so much to say about the designs that are being created, just expect that pretty much any deadline is going to get blown because everyone is going to have so much to say. They're going to keep iterating and iterating until they just run out of time and really can't iterate anymore. But designs are never really done. So just know that particularly if your company does something more like a waterfall where design comes first and then dev and then test, design is going to take up a lot of time and they don't mean to. It's just know that it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but it's really true. Just go on and know it's going to be late. Okay, so so give them some grace. All right, so I'm actually towards the end. So once again, user experience is a field of study focused on the end user experience end to end, companies, services, products end to end. And then UX and dev are intertwined. UX professionals bring perspectives from users and also just best practices from that. And then developers will bring the technology innovations together. So that's where that comes in. So if you want to learn a little bit more, I've got a few places that I recommend. The first from a professional side is UXPA, User Experience Professionals Association. So that's uxpa.org. They have conferences, local chapters, resources. That's really good. From a more academic side, I recommend the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, and particularly the papers and resources that come out of their various conferences. So they have a ton of conferences, but there is a huge one, the CHI, Computer Human Interaction, is their largest one, but they have a lot of other conferences that deal with specific facets of the user experience. So encourage you to look into that. And then IXDA is another one that's kind of up and coming, Interaction Design Association. And I've been involved with them here locally in Charlotte, for instance. And they're pretty good as well in terms of resources and talks and conferences and stuff like that. So keep them in mind. And that's all I got. So how else can I help you guys?
All right.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful.
That was great, yeah.
Thank you so much. It was so much to unpack. It was very rich. So thank you so much. And there was a bit of history in there as well. Theory was really good. So thank you so much. I guess, I do have some questions myself I wanted to ask, but I wanted to make sure that everybody gets a chance. Is there any question that people wanted to ask about UX?
I have questions too, but I want to let other people ask questions first.
And I'm reading through the chat. Sorry, I didn't check the chat while we were talking.
Oh, no.
I don't have any questions in particular, but it was really cool to hear about some of the different roles on teams for people who are interested in this kind of stuff. So thanks for highlighting that. That was really neat.
Sure. Bye.
I have a question.
Okay.
I think firstly, I want to thank you for sharing all that information. It was like super helpful to kind of understand some of the delineation between roles with UX and UI. I find that like even hearing you speak, I often conflate a lot of the responsibilities of the two. So it was really good to see kind of that distinction. I think from my personal experience, a roadblock that I come into, especially when I'm like wireframing or like trying to create a project, is that I generally find that I can kind of get things to look nice. Like the design aspect of it is easy enough to research in terms of like following design trends and looking at kind of like startup companies and competition and engaging like how something should look. I think what's harder sometimes is understanding like what should be on the screen and why. And so what you mentioned about like usability heuristics, for me personally, that was like my introduction to that concept. And it's like literally what I needed to hear. Like I kind of am looking for more information about like how I can better kind of like create projects and apps that are like user friendly in that way specifically. So I guess my question really is, are there any more like kind of like core UX principles or key kind of like ideas similar to that you think I should dive into, just like getting my feet wet in this field?
I mean, the NN Group's website, that's 20 years of gold. So they are Don and Jakob are the ones that, from beginning to end, still ongoing, can give you everything you need. Because that's still a difficult question to just kind of know, right? So that's why there is a such thing as research, because you still have to have some concept of what's the audience, what's their purpose. I joke about this really old Sprite commercial, but what's my motivation, right? Like, why am I here? What's going on? What are you offering me, right? So those questions are still fundamental foundational questions that need to be answered, but are difficult without that proper engagement with an audience of who you think you're designing for. And that's where I go back to why research is not just usability, because there is something called foundational research, right? I look at, say, it's something called a contextual inquiry. I look at, say, how you work now, and I understand where what I'm building is going to fit into how you work now, or even disrupt how you do that. Then we go from there to another layer down. Okay, what does that interaction look like? Okay, I might go back to you. Do you understand how this works? How do you use something similar? You would use all these other methods to get to that next step. Then we build it. Then we're coming into more of the usability. Okay, I've built it based on what I've learned from those other engagements. Did I hit the mark? Do you know how to complete your task without a lot of stress and error? Then we publish it, do maybe even A/B testing if we are not completely sure. Then we have metrics to measure, are people getting through it? Are they successful? How long is it taking? All of that. And when we start the cycle all over again. So it's really not the easiest of answers, even though we have things like templates and systems that help you spin up web pages really fast and things like that. Those tools are great. But again, I think they give almost a false sense that it is easy to know what to do, with this problem. It's not always easy, and it does take some work to figure that out. So the other way to do it as well would be to just take some guesses and then get the feedback, like kind of what Google used to do, at least, and somewhat does now with their betas, right? Label it a beta and throw it against the wall and get that feedback back. But that's what they were doing too, right? They didn't want to wait for all of the user feedback to come back. So they put enough out there to see where the gaps were, and then they keep iterating. So there's a couple of ways to do it, but yeah, so just keep in mind that you're not off in thinking that it is a lot, and therefore it's a whole profession. So.
Definitely. Thank you. I'm actually really excited to look into the NN group a bit more.
I think you're going to be a UX professional. I think I've got my first recruit, just so you know. Because if you care that much, just come on over.
We won't take much convincing, I don't think.
Hey, Michelle, can you talk a little bit about, I thought the 10 heuristics were great and just kind of dialing down into just the kind of different layers of decision making and distilling of information that needs to happen in an app. Can you talk a little bit more about the user control and freedom? And then, you know, I could see how that may also go too far, that you give too many options and then you end up in this paradox of choice for the user. So how you kind of dial in on finding what is the appropriate amount of choice and control to give without becoming overwhelming.
That's a good one. And it's actually funny enough, that is something I've kind of been thinking about, particularly from the point of view of accessibility, because what we find with the field of accessibility is that people have designed with a certain interaction and engagement in mind. So when you come with a different, say, tool that you want to use outside of a mouse, or you come with a different visual presentation, like you are recoloring the screen to maybe just black on white, then you run into problems with users being able to use the system because you've controlled, you know, the environment a little too much, and you've got not given people enough freedom to change that to what makes their device easiest to use. So, you know, there is no hard and fast, other than to say that to me, the definition of good design is that I, as a user, know what to do, but then have the freedom to do it however I need to do it, if that makes sense. So there should be some understanding that there is a task I can accomplish, and then I can, so I liken it to like a museum. So I went to, there's two museums in DC that I ended up going to on the same day. One was the African American Museum, and one is the Museum of American History. Weren't even planning on going to the Museum of American History, but the problem was the African American Museum has a certain experience they want you to do. So they put you in an elevator, they drop you at a certain point, and they want you to wind through a particular path of the museum. And usually there are tickets to limit the number of people that go through that experience at a time. My mom and I went when there were no tickets required, which we thought would be a good thing, but instead there were therefore like 200 people all starting the experience in these narrow hallways with these handful of artifacts all at one time, and it ruined the experience. So we popped over to the American History Museum, which we've been to a million times, but we had more freedom to go to the exhibits and pace ourselves as we wished. So I think that to me is an example of, they to me wanted a little bit too much control, walk through it this exact way, whereas I'm grown, I can, you know, I can figure out that maybe I want to see the good before the bad, and maybe I wanted to see when we were free before we were slaves. You know, don't tell me I got to start with slavery, right? Or things like that. Like they wanted you to go through it chronologically, whereas maybe if we had had more freedom, I would have enjoyed the experience more. So there is still an understanding that I came to this thing like a museum for a purpose, to see artifacts, to learn information. So I came to your app, I came to your site to do a thing, but then there is a point at which you have to let go and let the person. I think there's, you can use design principles, and this may go back to, sorry, your original question too. There are such things as design principles. Although those again still might get more into visual design than anything else. And then there's the WCAG for accessibility. So those are good guidelines there. But in terms of just a hard and fast, like you know it, it's one of those things, you know it when you got there. But you can, I think you still know it in terms of, you know that you should have identified a thing the person's trying to do. And if the person is able to do that thing, then that's your freedom and control. That's your control, and then your freedom is they can do it with however they want to engage. Super long answer. I hope it answered some kind of way.
No, it's perfect. And in fact, your analogy is probably better than you know. I'm currently an architect, so the idea of experience a building, and I have been to some of those buildings before. So yeah, no, I totally understand that you know, there's a big difference between trying to understand what the route the user wants to take when they arrive to the site is versus creating an experience to force a user through are two completely different methodologies. So that's a perfect answer. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, that's what it, and that's where, again, being mindful that those were created in '94. So again, if you think about what people were doing back then, they were doing like even the enter button, enter my site, and you will do the experience this exact way. So I think we've overcome some of that over time, just naturally. But it's still a good point to keep in mind, like, don't pigeonhole me, give me an exit, give me the opportunity to save and come back. All of these things are part of that user control and freedom.
Michelle, I wanted to make sure I understood what I thought I heard as a criticism of how a lot of companies go about UX. And it sounds like so Stacy and I both work at a company called Zapier, and we're 350 employees, but we have a UX research team. And they spend a lot of their time, they don't really spend their time on usability testing. That's more our designers do that. So they'll come up with a prototype of some sort and they'll test it against users. The UXR team spends their time interviewing users about what are they trying to do. So our company is a workflow automation company. And so they'll talk to them about when you hear the word automation, what do you think about? Like, what's your workflow day to day? What are the things, all those kinds of things. But I think the part that I think takes longer, like what you're talking about, is that sort of like basic or fun, foundational research, maybe, stuff that, Jakob and Don and, Tog and all those people were doing back in the day of, like, what's the easiest pixel to hit? It's the one underneath your mouse, though, those kinds of principles, right? That like really basic stuff. So these companies are not, what would you have like a SaaS company like ours? Like, what would you have our UX researchers do? Would you want them to do more of that, like contribute to kind of the corpus of the foundational research more? Or
it sounds like they are doing. If they're asking users about their current experiences, their current work experiences, and then bringing that information back to inform, I guess, the product design and the product features, that is phenomenal, because not a lot of people are doing that, right? Unfortunately, sometimes a lot of that push comes more from marketing or just the overall market itself and where that's headed, as opposed to sitting down with users and being able to bring back their points of view. So that is good. And then if the designers are doing some more of the usability research, that's fine too, because I was a designer who also did research. I just didn't do research on my thing. So that's another thing. You can have that cross-functional ability, just being mindful that you have to separate yourself from what you created, and you also have to be strong enough to critique your peers if something didn't turn out right. As long as you're able to do that, I think it also does make sense to have that more study of the thing that you made come more out of the design team. And then the researchers are doing the deeper dive, because that takes a lot of interpretation. Like, anyone can see what someone's doing in their day. I can see that you sit at your desk and type all day, but what do I do with that information, right? So knowing what to do with that information and how to turn that into a product feature, a design consideration, all of that, that's what a researcher is bringing to the table. So it sounds like, kudos. And then again, a lot of stuff about computers we've figured out. But, things like, I think we still have a lot more to learn about mobile devices, and definitely augmented reality, virtual reality, wearables, all of these things are going to need that same kind of study. Some of it is happening, but we also saw a lot of like research labs close, and, again, a lot of divestment from this idea of simply doing experimentation, innovation, iteration to get to the right core thing, in favor of just getting something out the door and to the people. Some people are able to still get it right, even under those pressures. So I'm not saying that we just have to spend 10 years on something, but I do think that we see the fruit of what happened when people were able to kind of slow down and really deep dive into both the hardware and software side of things. So as these new technologies come about, I think we're going to have to give it the same kind of grace to really get it right and make it something long lasting and not just a fad.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really interested in like the accessibility within VR, like how that's going to get solved.
DR.
VR, virtual
Oh,
reality.
okay. So I was like DR direct.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. DR, sorry. Okay. Yeah. And EJ saying we're still learning desktop web.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true.
that's true.
Yeah.
There's still always something. Well, there's always something that breaks something too, right? So there's always that reiterating on something you thought you had, and then someone goes, "But what about this?" So yeah.
Yeah, and another interesting thing about the desktop web is that devices now have such unpredictable sizes that it's a nightmare to be like, okay, how do we have a design that fits it all? But yeah, I wanted to ask you something about more like I guess the bigger picture in lots of ways. But I guess I'm thinking, do you know? I mean, it might not be the bigger picture after all, but is there some sort of like state of the UX? I wonder if there's been like some sort of study of like, right now in 2020, how is our user experience? Is there such an effort that you're aware of to kind of measure that in a way?
Yeah, so there are a few collectives that do that. Literally, they'll do the state of UX every year. This is where I'll admit that I live more in the accessibility world than the UX world, and I tend not to pay as much attention to those state of the UX things. Only because that's also just part of my personality too. I'm one of these people that I'll pay attention once it's really settled in. Like I was late to the smartphone. I was flip phone for a long time until y'all really let me know that this smartphone thing was going to hang around. So that's just me. So all of these things that are like this year, okay, that's cute, but I'm still in 1983, psychology of human computer interaction. I'm still digesting that, there's still some good nuggets in there. So you're 2020, here's the hits. Sure, okay. I also don't particularly care for those though, because, and flip phone, I don't have a flip phone now, but I wish I could. Anyway, I also don't pay attention to those too, just because sometimes I find the things that they call like the new, like they'll put accessibility on there. I'm sorry, accessibility is not the new craze. Accessibility is the thing you should have been teaching us in school all along, right? So that to me, again, discredits a little bit this idea of like UX and, we know the things. Sometimes I don't even trust it because again, it's the arc, there's actually a graph on the NN group about how much UX has exploded. There's like a graph that's like a little line, and then it just shoots up. So I think there's almost like a resettling that has to happen even in the UX field for me to go back and pay attention to that a little bit more, because there's just so much newness happening with technology that the other point that always comes to mind is that standards come after innovation. So that's the other thing too, that we have all these standards now because the web was innovated and iterated, over these decades. And now we're at a point where we have things like guidelines and standards. But now we have all this new stuff again, video conferencing and, all these new technologies. They're still in the innovation phase. And I tend not to work in the innovation phase so much as let me know when it's a standard and it has a guideline to it. So again, I'm not one to keep up with the trends so much as wait for the dust to settle when we're in the standard phase. And then I kind of advocate for us to use those best practices going forward. Yeah. So get another guest speaker to come in who's like, the president of their local UXPA or something. They will be able to answer that much better than me.
Oh no, I wasn't, I wasn't trying to.
No, I'm literally telling you, go get like the president of some local UXPA. They'll probably give you a whole different talk than me. And then you'll have both sides of it, see?
And I do have another question, and you might not like this one either. But I guess, there's something that can be very comforting about being able to measure with metrics some sort, something, so that way you kind of get a better sense of like, okay, we're reaching our goal. Like I feel, I mean, I know you mentioned accessibility, and this is something that is dear to you as well. I feel like there's lots of ways to measure how accessible your website is. Is there such a thing for UX? Because I know you mentioned return on investment earlier, and I know, like, from the business side, that, you know, in a company, somebody's gonna, like, the executives, the higher ups, I guess, for lack of a better word, they're going to be more able to listen to you if you're able to measure something and tell them, hey, look, this progress is giving us, it has this return, it makes our site better. So, you know, I guess maybe devil's advocate for like metrics of UX, how would you do that?
Yes, so there are ways to measure. Depends on what your organization values most. Funny enough, for instance, like time on task, unfortunately, at some organizations, they actually want to keep you on the website longer. So it doesn't help to, you know, have a faster interaction, but, you know, still, like, the engagement, what people, you can measure, you know, how long people are engaged with the things you want them engaged with, the dwell times and the time on task and the time on the page, versus maybe the things that you want them to speed through or have more efficiency. You can measure those. You can measure click-through rates, and, you know, all those sort of measures that you probably already think of do apply also to usability and UX as well. Okay, so the one measure that's probably not that great is the one that everyone's using now. Oh, I'm gonna forget the name of it, and you guys know exactly what I'm talking about, but it's the one that's like, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend? Oh God, I'm a terrible UX professional, but I don't remember the name of this.
NPS, Net Promoter Score.
Thank you. That one's actually, don't use that. That actually has been disproven. I don't even think it was meant to be used the way it's been used. But you can do measures like that as well. You can get, you know, feedback from your customers on, you know, how do they like the product, and are they more engaged with it? Are they more likely to use it, recommend it, things like that. So absolutely. And that's something we were actually working on at Pearson, for instance, was being able to, over time, even from a professional standpoint, you want to justify your existence as a UX professional. You want to be able to say, we brought this improvement to your company. And so you can use some of those same metrics to do that and to baseline where someone was before versus after some significant changes.
Thank you so much. Are there more questions?
I was gonna say, like, we're already a little over time, right? So if there are more questions, but luckily Michele is in our Slack team, and so if Michele, if you're open to it, people can tag you into questions, further questions.
Sounds good.
That'd be amazing.
Share my screen one more time in case you guys want to reach out as well. I had this last slide here. So Twitter, MAW Consulting, just drop the I, MAW Consulting LLC, just drop the I from consulting. Email them info@MAW Consulting LLC, and my website is MAW Consulting LLC. So if you remember,
Stacy tagged you into a tweet, and I retweeted it. So everyone here should have that Twitter handle handy.
Yes, I'm terrible. I should have been, like, you know, screenshotting and being like, hey, I'm
So.
I forgot. Thank you.
That's all right.
Well, thank you so much, Michele, for that amazing talk. That was really good. A nice deep dive and a good way to explore all these roles that, you know, sometimes you don't really think about when it comes to UX. So thank you again for all of this hard work. And I guess I'll thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Of course, and I guess I wanted to take this opportunity just to tease the next talk, which is going to happen in 2 weeks, as usual, on Wednesday, 5 p.m. Pacific time, and we're going to talk with Eric Bailey about accessibility. So we're pretty big. We're going pretty big on accessibility. So yeah, that's going to be another, you know, the foundations of accessibility and what it is and how you can work with it. So again, thank you so much for everybody for being here. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll see each other very soon.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'll make slides available on my website. I think Rachel was asking that. Yeah, so if you hit my website, go to webinars. I'm going to make up a thing in like a day or two, and you should be able to get the slides from there.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Great job.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.